All right. So this week we are looking at this idea of human life, beginnings and endings. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is a very challenging topic. It is one that many people feel passionately about. It is one that is extremely divisive, especially in political realms. It can be divisive between gender, and it can be divisive between religious understandings or beliefs. At the beginning of the chapter, a question is posed. Let me read that for you. It says, quote, "It is unethical to terminate human life, whether it is a single embryonic cell at the beginning of life or a full human body at the end of life." Now, think about that question. Pull out your textbook if you need to. Read through that line again. It is unethical to terminate human life, whether it is a single embryonic cell at the beginning of life or a full human body at the end of life. How do you feel about that statement? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And importantly, why? As we try to understand the ethical background of this issue, as we try to be consistent in the way that we understand, the way that we argue, the way that we would answer that question should play a significant role in how we feel about many topics that we will look at this week. I wanted to start by just briefly going over some of the major issues. Now, these are available in the textbook, but let me just provide a basic background, just a short discussion of each of these, just to ensure that we are all on the same page when it comes to these often medical or scientific terms. Abortion. I think most people know what abortion is. Abortion is the premature termination of a pregnancy. But there is some discussion of when does an abortion or when can an abortion take place. I know recently there have been advances in pharmaceutical companies. There are over-the-counter, the night after drugs, which is a way in case someone were to become pregnant. The following day, they can take this pill, and it would help to terminate that embryo, that fetus. Would one consider that an abortion? At that moment, right, the organism, right, the fetus is extremely small, right, just a few cells. But do those constitute life? And if it isn't at that moment, when do those cells become alive? Right? Is it okay for a woman to abort those cells at that moment? Is it appropriate for a woman to abort those cells after 22 weeks? How about after 32 weeks? At what point does it become not acceptable to you? Or does it ever become unacceptable? A few years ago, there was a doctor in Philadelphia who was arrested and charged with murder because he and his staff at his clinic were conducting late-term abortions, sometimes even having live births, at which time the doctor would sever the spine and killing the baby and disposing of the baby, or disposing of the embryo. So if that is wrong, right? If killing a baby once it is born is wrong, when and how does it become okay, right? Now, my purpose isn't to engage in a debate about whether or not abortion is acceptable or unacceptable, whether it should be legal or illegal. But essentially, what I want you to do is to consider, well, how do you think about abortion? Do you think abortion is wrong? Okay, that's fine. Wonderful. Why do you think abortion is wrong? And you would probably say something along the lines of that you feel that it's unethical to terminate a human life. Okay, so when does a human life become a human life? Does a human life become a human life when it is born? When that baby is viable outside of the mother's womb? Does a cell become a human life at a certain period after a baby starts having brain function, after a heart begins to beat, after their fingernails are formed? Does a cell become a human life at conception? Now, once you've kind of determined how you feel about that topic and how you can organize your thoughts, then we need to consider then how you think about other topics, right? Should it matter if you feel that it is wrong to take any human life? Does it matter how the child was conceived? Does it matter if it was by incest? Does it matter if it was by rape? Does it matter if the mother's life is in jeopardy? Again, I don't care how you actually think about the topic, but I want you to work through to understand why you feel the way you do about that topic, all right? Because ultimately what we're trying to do is create a system by which we can organize our ethical stances. So if you believe that a human life begins at the moment of conception, that those two little eggs, that egg and that sperm create life, and that doing anything on that life is inappropriate, is wrong, then how would you feel about this idea of genetic engineering? And that is altering the DNA within a cell to change the outcome of that organism. How do you feel about doing stem cell research, which are taking the cells and modifying them, doing research on them? These can be taken from human embryos that are about a week old and consist of about 100 cells. Right? If you believe that life begins at the moment of conception, and you argue that the reason why you feel that way is because it is a human life, then I would argue that you must then also feel very strongly about stem cell research and be opposed to stem cell research, because those cells those embryos that are being researched on are, by your definition, alive. How do you feel about suicide? Does one have the right to take their own life? Does one have the ability to have what's called an assisted suicide or euthanasia? Right? Does one have, if one is terminally ill, does one have the right to take their own life? Whether as a way of saving money, of not being a burden on one's family, as a way to escape the pains of death or of disease, right? Is there not something extremely liberating about taking control of one's life and one's fate? So consider these issues as you go through, as you do the reading this week. Ultimately, more than how do you feel about a topic, but I do expect you to have some feeling. Why do you feel the way that you do? And is your thought process consistent with all the different topics that are being discussed?